I'm Jackie of Stitching Across the Globe, and this is the 5th and final week of the Slea Head Quilt Along. By the end of this week, you're going to have a completed quilt top. I'm so excited to see what you make. Now I'm going to show you some of my tips and tricks to get the best quilt top you possibly can. Let's get started. To assemble your quilt block, you're going to start assembling your rows. So you're going to use one F-sashing in between each block. I'm going to do this the same way as the smaller sashing, where I pin on the ends and then from the middle, and this just makes sure everything's lined up and I don't have too much shifting while I'm sewing. Other end, and then I'll kind of let it lay flat there. Find my middle. On this size of sashing, I'll use about 5 pins. How many you use is really up to your comfort level, but I feel like that gives me a nice hold, beginning in, middle, and then the 2 spots there. And I will sew a sashing to the right side of every block that needs it, and then assemble my rows, because I find it's easier to sew this little piece of sashing when I'm not dealing with a whole row and I'm just having a single block. And then make sure that these seams, because they're pressed towards the sashing, that they lay flat as they go underneath the foot of your needle. My foot likes to flip them on me, so I gotta be careful of that. And you'll just want to check the diagram and the pattern or your photo of your layout in order to check your block orientation and placement to make sure you're sewing onto the correct side. And then I like to press my sashing before I sew the blocks together, because it just makes it behave a little bit more, because we're dealing with such a long piece. And I press from the top. Just watch your fingers with the iron. These will go together right like this. I like to sew with my sashing piece on top because I find it's just a little bit easier. So I'm going to flip that one over the top, and then I'll pin it and sew it the same way as when I was just doing the sashing. I'll pin each end and then work my way out. Now that I've got my rows all sewn, I'm just going to press my sashing out. Make sure it's nice and flat on the back. I like to press it again from the front to make sure it's nice and pretty and flat. And then I'll have a second sashing, since I'm doing the throw size. It's 3 blocks wide by 3 blocks tall. Now this, I've got so much fabric here, it's a little more challenging to hold up, so I can just kind of bunch it in my hands a little bit while I nose my iron in there. Then I'll flip it. Press it from the front. If you've got any little stray threads like that, you can just snip them real close to your seam. Be careful not to snip your fabric. Now that we have our rows assembled, it's time to make our horizontal sashing. The sizes of this will vary depending on the size of the quilt that you're making, so go ahead and look at the pattern for that. But a tip that I have is that some of these sashings, and the borders are made essentially the same, they can get pretty long. For example, I'm making the throw size, and I need sashing that is 53.5 inches, and my board only goes up to 36 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my sashing in half, and then I'm going to figure out what half of my needed width is, which is 26 3/4, And then I'm gonna cut from the fold. So I'm just gonna line this up with the edge of my board, make sure I'm nice and straight. I'm doing this backwards so it's harder to count. So I'm just gonna flip around here, line up with the edge of my board, make sure my sashing is nice and straight. And then, because I'm cutting it doubled over, I need 26 3/4. 26 3/4. And there I was able to cut my sashing to a long length without actually having to try to figure out what that length is. And your border pieces, you can make the exact same way. You'll sew the appropriate number of pieces end to end, just like I did here with the sashing. And then you can fold it in half and cut half of the length that you need in order to get your border. Now for your long sashing pieces and your border pieces, you're gonna treat them the exact same way you did your longer sashing with pinning. Start at each end so that, because we know we cut it to the right length. And then you want to find the center. So this is a little bit longer, so it's harder to do. So I'm just going to fold this in half, kind of make sure my sashing's in there. It's all twisted here. Let's see, there we are. I'm gonna fold those guys in half and stick a pin in there. And now I can do a half of this at a time, and it's a little bit more manageable. See, so I've got from pin to pin, and now I can lay it flat, which is how I find it easiest to do. And then stick a few pins in there. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Just lay it nice and flat. Line up my edges. Stick a few pins in there. And I'm ready to start sewing. And you're just going to do this for every piece of sashing and your 4 border pieces, and press in between each step. And now I'm sewing my final border piece, which is always super exciting to me. So some things to consider as you're assembling your final quilt top when you start sewing all your sashing rows together and sewing your binding on, is make sure you have plenty of space to the left of your machine, because the weight of the quilt's going to get pretty heavy and it's going to try to drag off your machine and into the floor if you don't have something up here supporting the weight. I also put a folding TV tray right to my left so that when I still have some weight of the quilt in my lap, I'm going to have that weight off to the left of me, as well as on my desk off to the left of the machine. So if at all possible, just try to kind of set yourself up with that extra space. It'll just make sewing this better, easier. It'll make sewing this easier. You won't be wrestling your fabric so much as it tries to drag off your machine. We're almost there. We're at the home stretch. Another thing is I backstitch at the very end of these seams. So when I get right here to the edge, I'm going to do a couple stay stitches, because this is right at the edge of my quilt where it could get stressed before I actually quilt my top. So now I'm going to press my last seam, and I'm going to take this outside for the final reveal, and I'll show you what my quilt top looks like. And that wraps up our Slea Head Quilt Along. I am so happy that you decided to join me. I can't wait for all our future fun together. And I really want to see the quilt top that you finished this month. Share it on Instagram with the hashtag Slea Head Quilt Along and tag me at Stitching Across the Globe. Alternatively, you can shoot me an email at quilts@stitchingacrosstheglobe.com. I hope you enjoyed yourself. See you next time.